activists, and Rick will do anything to keep her alive and to be with her.
Mm-hmm. I really enjoyed. Yeah, I wanted to say I really enjoy both characters. You've done an awful lot of work developing these characters, but I think I mentioned to you the other day that to a certain degree, I think Eve is becoming one of my favorite characters, and out of the two books you've done in the series so far.
Well, it surprised me. I hate to say this because it always makes me think I'm sounding like some grad student in creative fiction, but it surprises me too. She was supposed to be a kind of a cardboard figure to, play against Rick, and I just liked the way she talked, and I liked the way she accepted this broken man. This man who had built a huge shell around himself. This man who drove motorcycles like an insane idiot. And just kept loving him until he broke, until it got through. And, she's brave and she's strong and she's tough. I didn't know that. It was only when she started talking.
I think that's such a fascinating aspect.
It was a pleasure.
That an author, as he creates his characters, he's really not quite sure what the future holds for the characters. It's all, in other words, it's not really set in your mind all the way to the end at all.
No.
You surprise yourself.
It's not for me. I mean, there are people, I believe, who write everything out and have everything worked out. And I just know, after I've gotten to a certain point, that there are certain things that a character, it would be natural for them to say, and there are certain things that it would not. That's about as far as I can get, and if it's not natural for them to say something, I have to go back and erase it. And she's not based on anybody, by the way, that I know. I mean, I'm very happily married, and I've had a pretty good life. But I don't never met anybody like her. But she seems to be real in a very real way.
Well, that's what I so much love about the characters that you create. They are very real to me.
The other characters. I had somebody actually write in a review that I had copied. Rick lives in a group house, which is where I lived and where everybody at that age lived, in their 20s in Washington, D.C. They shared group houses. There weren't that many places. And his roommates are computer hackers. They're freaks. They're, geeks. They're in the mainframes and they're running things and they're way ahead of everybody else. And people told me that I had taken them from some other book. No, they were my roommates. I mean, these were guys. I had 3 roommates who were like this. They were. I mean, one of them was almost completely incapable of speaking to humans. The other one was a crazy person who would go to work at Westinghouse in sneakers and frayed shorts. They were brilliant, nuts, and so far out ahead of anybody else in terms of, we were still typing with typewriters and carbon paper, and there were no fax machines or computers or cell phones. So, this really was the dark ages. But as usual, just as, yes, I rode a motorcycle for ABC, Rick Putnam is much better at riding a motorcycle, and he's cooler, and he's better looking. And, these guys are smarter and, neater than the people I lived with, but not much.
Well, Terry, there's a second, I guess we could say, a second type of historical background that pushes the book in the second part of the book, having to do with religious cults. And so this is a good point. We're going to take a short commercial break. And when we come back from the commercial break, we'll come back with another dramatic reading from Terry Irving's book, Warrior.
Great.
Millions of young people will enter the workforce this summer, many for the first time. Join OSHA and construction professionals nationwide to help build a safe work foundation. OSHA's Teen Summer Job Safety Campaign helps teens learn good safety habits at the beginning of their careers and stay safe and healthy on the job. For more information, visit OSHA.gov or call 800-321-OSHA.
A message from the U.S. Department of Labor.
May 21st, 1973, Georgetown, Washington, D.C. Rick piloted the bus down M Street in Georgetown. If anything, Georgetown looked worse than before he left. The Summer of Love and Woodstock had plowed head-on into Altamont, and the human debris from that disaster was everywhere. Kids ranging from college age down to 11 or 12 years old were drifting up and down the sidewalks, smoking cigarettes in doorways or trying to catch some sleep in the afternoon sun. Rick thought that it must be tough to find a safe place to sleep at night, so a nap during the day could be a real lifesaver for these wanderers. D.C. Metro Police were cruising Wisconsin Avenue on their Vespas, blowing horns at the sleepers, or, for those too tired or too stoned to react, parking the little scooters and walking over to deliver a sharp rap on the sole of their foot. The kids would pick up their backpacks, plastic bags, and surplus army gear and rejoin the slow drift to another place to sleep. The more alert were working the tourists for coins at the corner of M and Wisconsin. Through the open van windows, Rick could hear all the variations of, "Got any spare change?" He remembered a panhandler in Manhattan who'd given him a 2-minute stand-up comedy routine before hitting him up for cash. Afterward, he had pursued Rick down the sidewalk and insisted that there must have been a mistake. Rick said the 20 was no mistake. His performance was better than most he'd seen at the improv clubs. By comparison, these kids were barely trying. As he crept along in the solid mass of traffic, he had time to notice the predators. They looked like kids, but their faces were a little sharper, a lot more awake, and far more calculating. Repeatedly, they'd come up to a kid, usually one who was alone, offer a cigarette, and then start a quiet and serious discussion. Rick knew that the pimps worked the bus station over on New York Avenue, so he figured these were the various cults out to save these poor young souls. Most of the kids just took the cigarette and stared blankly in the general direction of their benefactor. Others had that desperate look of someone well past the end of their rope, and they listened intently. Rick remembered what it was like. One year he'd hitched down to the Daytona motorcycle races with just enough money to buy an infield ticket. Most of it was fantastic. The almost solid sound of 100 race-tuned engines at maximum revolutions, swooping riders almost parallel to the asphalt in the turns, riders drafting and fighting for position. Other parts weren't quite as enjoyable. Camping in the grassy area next to the track with hundreds of drunken pagans, warlocks, banditos, and a mixed bag of Florida outlaws, Mongols, and other hangers-on. The worst was when he tried to take a nap under the boardwalk and got worked over by a platoon of Jesus freaks. It felt as practiced and planned as an NVA ambush. Before he was fully awake, they'd offered him water, food, and cigarettes, and one particularly attractive girl was sitting on his backpack. They had never stopped smiling as they told him how happy they were, how miserable their lives on the street had been, what incredible love and affection they had for each other, and the glorious sense of joy when they accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. They'd all gathered around him in a warm huddle. Later he learned that this was called snapping, so completely filling the potential recruits with love and warmth that they would suddenly snap into the group. Rick just felt awkward and uncomfortable. He ducked down and out of the embrace retrieved his backpack by tumbling its rider onto the sand and escaped. His childhood with an alcoholic parent had given him a thick armor against anyone who used love as a weapon. Even so, he could still feel the powerful pull of that promise of unconditional love and acceptance.
Storytellers-Campfire in progress. I'm your host, Rich-Gehlhausen, with author Terry Irving.
Hi there.
Hi, Terry. I want the audience to know they've been listening to a reading from your new book, Warrior.
And before you
program.
ask, yes, that did happen to me.
Something similar to that? Or something exactly like that?
Yeah, they pretty well locked me in and sat on my backpack, and, I wasn't about to go along with it. But in that period, in the 68, 69, 70, 71, 72, I had 3, 4, 5 friends, one relative, disappear into cults, and have only, to my intense surprise, seen some of them resurface in the past 1 or 2 years. That's 40 years. I mean, we don't have that sort of cult now. I mean, that's not something I worry about with my, well, not now, they're a little bit older, but I mean my daughters. But then you would walk down M Street in Georgetown, and you would be hit over and over and over again by these poor, sort of tired kids who had been sent out to sell candles or pictures of their particular god or whatever to raise money. And there were deprogrammers and desperate parents. And not too, well, I will anyway, a good number of these cults ended up being either physically abusive to the people that joined or sexually abusive. But the power of these cults was just, once you were in, you were right. Everybody else was wrong. And you were doing the right thing. And it is extremely difficult to get out of them. I actually knew one friend from high school who was thrown out of the Unification Church for asking too many questions, which I frankly think is probably a world record, but that's only one person.
Well, your novel, it definitely has a lot of twists and turns, and using a religious cult. What's the effect on our protagonists, Rick and Eve? They find themselves back in D.C. and they're confronted by these religious cults.
Well, in Wounded Knee, and this is a part again that's in the American Indian Movement histories and not in the official histories. But the day that really broke the back of the siege was one where a very coordinated attack occurred, and actually firing was on both the Indians and the law enforcement agents, to the point where the security forces were speaking to each other and trying to identify where the shading was coming from. There was a third force, and some people will say, no, there absolutely wasn't. And but I took that image of a third force. What would a third force be like? What would it be doing there? And I also took the image that most of the people who ran these cults were perfectly willing, not perfectly willing, but were corrupt in my mind. I'm not a big believer. And I posited a corrupt cult that was hired to support, to basically destroy the American Indian Movement so that more lands would be open to strip mining. A good old American combination of money and religion and power. And that's what Rick ran into when he got back to Washington. Plus, there's also a young woman in it, a young girl,